You have entered Roguelike Radio.
Hello and welcome to Roguelike Radio, the procedurally generated podcast where all of the participants eventually die. This episode we are talking about chaos theory and procedural generation, and I am joined today by Alexei Pepers. Did I get that right?
Thank you for having me. Yes, Alexei Pepers.
So this episode is motivated quite specifically by Alexei's talk that she gave to the Roguelike Celebration event in San Francisco just a couple of months ago. Alexei, do you want to give the brief on that?
Sure, yeah. So I gave 2 talks at Roguelike Celebration this year. One was a guided tour of the NetHack codebase, which was a lot of fun, but is not what we're talking about today. The other was a lightning talk on, this very topic. I called it, what did I call it? It was a horrible pun. Butterflies of the Overworld, which is a Eyes of the Overworld NetHack pun combined with butterfly effective chaos theory. I wrote the talk slides like the night before the presentation, so I'm happy to get a chance to expand on what I was going over in that talk. And and I also, so just to give a bit of explanation of who I am, I'm a professional game designer currently working at Improbable Canada, and on the roguelike side I've been a NetHack player and fan for a long time, and I first presented at Roguelike Celebration in its inaugural year in 2016, where I presented on accessibility for visually impaired players in NetHack, which I wanted to mention partly because it was very much inspired by and built off of the Roguelike Radio episode 48 on playing NetHack with visually impaired players.
Well, it's still one of our coolest episodes we've done, I think. So, yes, chaos theory. Can you describe in 20 words what chaos theory is?
20 words. Let me think. Yeah.
You don't have to count the words. It's okay.
Well, actually, there's a nice little quote, and I'll just steal that, which is, chaos is when the present determines the future, but the approximate present does not approximately determine the future, which is a quote by Edward Norton, who's a very influential figure in chaos theory. Essentially, it's a study of systems, and particularly systems which are deterministic, so they're not random, and yet they are not predictable. So knowing more or less the situation that the system is in right now, even though it's deterministic, cannot tell you with perfect information the future state of the system due to the system being sensitive to initial conditions, which is basically the butterfly effect, which I can get into with a kind of case study that helps explain it a bit more.
Well, you've already mentioned butterflies in relation to NetHack, so I think we do indeed need an explanation of the butterfly effect.
Yeah, so one thing I'll mention, so I am not a chaostician, which is the term for a chaos theory studying mathematician, but I am a hobbyist. And most of my knowledge comes from a book called Chaos, Making a New Science by James Gleick. And I want to just plug it because A, that's like my primary source, and B, it's a fantastic book. It goes over the entire development of chaos theory from a neat kind of humanized historical perspective. So it's very approachable reading. You don't have to be a mathematician to understand it, because like I said, I'm not. So I would recommend if you find this talk interesting, or you just have watched Jurassic Park enough times that you really want to know what Ian Malcolm's talking about, then it's a great read. So getting into what I said, so the butterfly effect, this comes from a historical situation. So Edward Lorenz, who I just quoted at the beginning of this podcast, was this mathematician who was fascinated with weather when he was a child. And he went into mathematics, but back into weather during World War II, where he was conscripted as a meteorologist. And so he ended up staying in weather and meteorological work, but with a mathematics background, which made him a bit of an odd duck as far as that went. And what made him really weird is that in the 1960s, he had this strange, horrible machine, which was called a computer. And at the time, this was something that was very untrustworthy among serious scientists. It was some kind of souped-up calculator that was hardly appropriate for a serious theoretical scientist to be working with. But he had a Royal McBee vacuum computer, which was huge. It took up most of his office. It was super loud. It broke down once a week. But what he did with it is he created a toy weather system. So he had 12 different equations that modeled temperature, wind pressure, and things like that. And that would let him simulate what the weather would be in his kind of virtual Earth on a day-to-day basis. And this is something that I think us as modern fans of video games that rely on simulation and stuff, it sounds pretty standard, but this was quite revolutionary at the time. Not a lot of people were doing this. And something he did was that to understand the weather, just reading out the numbers was a bit of a pain. So he came up with a way of visualizing it. So he would pick something like temperature. And what he would do is that at each point in time, he would print out a number of spaces equal to the value and then the letter A. So if it was 25 degrees Celsius, he would print out 25 spaces and then the letter A. And then if the next step of the simulation, it was 26 degrees, it would be 26 spaces and an A. And that gave him this little line of A's going across the printed paper that he could then go through with a pen. And he would have a visualization of how that variable was changing over time, which is, nowadays we have very easy access to visual output. But back in 1960, it had to be kind of hacked in. And so the important event in history is that in 1961, I believe, he noticed in his printout that there was a particularly interesting little weather feature that had gone on, and he thought that he wanted to try looking at it again to get some more information. And since he was printing out the values on his paper, what he did was that he took the values and he stopped his simulation, and he put the values right before that weather event back in as the starting condition and restarted the simulation. And then he went to get a cup of coffee. And when he came back, he found something really unexpected, which is that as the simulation had run, it had started out looking like it had the first time he'd run it, but it started to diverge a little bit until it became massively different. And within the course of a few simulated days, it looked like an entirely different weather simulation. And so this was very shocking because he had put in the same numbers. And given that this was a deterministic computer simulation, how could it possibly be that those same numbers created a different output? And what he found out was that because he was printing the numbers to 3 decimal points, but the simulation used 6 decimal points, that difference of 1/1000th of a number was enough to create large-scale differences. And this was shocking because the understanding at the time was that small errors in terms of your approximation could only ever result in very small errors in terms of what you would be calculating. There was no way that tiny errors could result in massive differences. But he had just proved very simplistically that this, could in fact happen. And it was called the butterfly effect because he covered this work in a paper called "Does the Flap of a Butterfly's Wings in Brazil Set Off a Tornado in Texas?" And the idea here is that it's not that the butterfly's wings cause something like a tornado, it's that by not accounting for something as small in terms of difference of if a butterfly's wings has created a little puff of wind, that little difference that you didn't account for in your simulation means that your calculated future can be so vastly different that there could be a tornado that would not occur in your simulation that would occur in the real world.
Indeed. So the application then to procedural generation was really interesting because his chaos theory does not involve randomness, which people might assume it involves randomness. And actually, computers do not involve randomness. Every method we have for generating random numbers uses some sort of fake system. So the way in which we procedurally generate things actually can always be recreated, just in the same way that the flap of the butterfly's wings potentially leading to the tornado, that can be represented through a seed in a procedural generation system, whereby if you know the initial starting points, then you always know the final outcomes, as long as you're tracking all those different ways in which the system moves.
Yeah, that's right. Our procedural generation systems do tend to be purely deterministic. So you will always get the same output given the same input. But yeah, seeds are a good example of, a lot of games will present to you a numerical seed or something like that. And having a seed number, if you go from, 1000 to 1001, you'll get a vastly different generated outcome because the series of processes that go through are going to change very largely because of that small change in the initial conditions. And so where this particularly ties into the procedural generation side is due to an essay in Procedural Generation in Game Design, edited by Tanya Short and Darren Adams, which I believe you've talked about several times on Roguelike Radio.
Yeah, it features many Roguelike Radio regulars as authors of different chapters in that book.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic book. I adore it. And one of my favorite chapters or essays was Understanding the Generated by Gillian Smith. And so when I read that chapter, it immediately in my mind struck a chord in tying back to my kind of hobby interest in chaos theory. And that was what motivated me to give this talk. So to go over Gillian's work for people who may not have read the essay, she is concerned with how to study the output of generative systems, so how to understand what a system is generating. So there's a nice quote from that essay where she says that it's easy to determine the success or failure of a generator based only on what we witness come from the system as developers. But unless the generative system is intended to create only one artifact, at some point we need to understand the generator as a whole. So she defines several interesting ways of looking at the output of your generative system in a way that lets you visualize patterns. So she talks about a generative space, which is all of the content that one kind of setup of your generator can create. So using her type of examples, if you have something that's generating maps for a platformer, and you might have some variables in terms of how large can the platforms be, how much space does there tend to be between them. If you have one set of, platform width is 2, platform space is 1, and then you run that map generator over and over again and you get 20 maps, those 20 maps are one generative space. And then what she calls the expressive range is that then if you were to take something like the platform length variable and make it 4 instead of 2, you could generate a new set of 20 maps that would be another generative space. And these are all things coming from your same system, but by tweaking the parameters, you could create like new spaces of possible content. And the expressive range is all of these different spaces that your generator could possibly create. And so she comes up with a way of visualizing those different outputs in a way that lets you see patterns. So if you figure out a metric where you can say, my map, I'm going to measure how difficult it is in terms of how often an AI I run through it dies or something like that. Or you can try and say, what's the average amount of distance in height between platforms? You come up with some numbers, some metrics, and then you can evaluate all of your levels by those metrics and get kind of just a vector, a series of numbers representing that level. And you can create this neat kind of graph where those metrics become values on like an XY plane, and you create a dot where if, your X and Y is 0 to 1, and you have a map that's at 0.5 difficulty and 0.5 linearity, then that becomes a dot right in the middle of your grid. And if you do this over and over again for all of your generated levels, you get a nice colored plot of all the things that generative space created. And then if you do this for all of your possible generative spaces and put them next to each other, you can start visually seeing some patterns in terms of, I tend to create levels with this generator that are very linear, or it turns out with a certain set of parameters, I can create levels that are exceptionally difficult. And you can tune your generator by looking at the output in a visual way.
Yeah, and this idea of the different level of variability to certain sets of levels that are produced, for instance, we widely see that Diablo, for instance, uses a particular form of level generation that involves gluing different prefabricated pieces together, which has a very low variability. Like over however many runs of a game, you're likely to see similar configurations over and over again. And that's not just due to the number of iterations being low, but just the type of iterations being so similar to each other due to the base building blocks being so big. Whilst some on the far end, you can have a essentially completely random, like a completely noise generator, which technically will produce much more variable stuff, but from a play perspective, actually is quite samey, quite boring. So it's technically unique, but has these other features which don't really stand out across multiple incarnations.
Yeah, and what I find so appealing about this idea is that, as a game designer, when you're making a generative system, something like a level generator, usually what you're doing to try and figure out if you did a good job or not is that you are running the generator, you're looking at the level, and you're kind of trying to eyeball it. Maybe you play through it in your game. and you try and get a feel for, oh, is this a good level or not? And, as a human being, you only have so much time in the day. So maybe you do that 20 times and you're like, well, of those 20 levels, 18 of them were really good and 2 were kind of not so great, but what can you do? And you have to kind of do your best to play enough levels to feel like you have a good sense of what you're generating. But then, of course, there's the problem that as soon as you put that out and share it with, the wider community, they'll be playing it so many more times that they'll see more levels or more instances of your generated content than you ever could have seen yourself. And so I find like it's a concern as a game designer of how do I understand the output of my generator well enough to feel confident that it's good. And this is a way of saying that you don't have to see every single level yourself. You can come up with this way of visualizing the whole output space and looking at it from this kind of zoomed out angle and get a much better idea of the patterns of like, what does the whole space look like, instead of having to try and infer that just based on a very small subset.
Yeah, and it's frequently gamers, like people that are really into specific games, will get to know the underlying patterns behind the engine quite quickly. So Spelunky players, for instance, or an expert Spelunky player on starting a new level will have an instinctual idea of where the exit is, because they've played so many Spelunky levels that they can see what they see of the initial screen. They can guess where the exit is just from their knowledge of how the generator tends to be set up. And certainly I know from playing ADOM quite considerably that I can guess the shape of a level in advance when going into a new level, because I know the way in which the dungeon tends to create new levels. For a new player, that wouldn't be the case. But yeah, expert players will pick up these patterns over time.
Yeah, I found that really interesting because I find I play NetHack enough that I have a sense of the shape of the level, and particularly a sense of where secret doors will be, based on what I've seen of the shape of the level, what I know of kind of where they tend to be on walls. I have just an instinct for it. It's a very subconscious thing. And that was something I found when I was doing my research on accessibility, because I was giving NetHack to players who'd never played the game before, and in that case, who were also trying to play it kind of blind. And that was something that was actually like a big hiccup, was that NetHack, you quite often have secret doors and things like that. And I found that the combination of players not having that intuition, and then the sheer matter of the accessibility making it harder to visualize the level and harder to go through the process of looking for doors, made it way more difficult. And it made me realize it wasn't until that moment that I even knew that I had that level of instinctive understanding of the generator of NetHack levels. I never would have thought that I'd picked that up until I saw what it was like when someone didn't have it.
Yeah. I mean, that particular example is not great for accessibility, but no. in general, it's an interesting feature that our players actually interact in a way with not just the generator, but the generative space. That part of mastering the game becomes a mastering not just level by level, but getting to know the whole system and how it works. There's an interesting thing there for players to play with.
Yeah, and as a designer, the step between the generative space to the expressive space, as to use Gillian's terms, is that movement of, if I have a generator of levels that's working pretty well, but then I know that there are like all those tweaking numbers in there of like, if you have something that's like a Diablo style construction of tiles, it's like, if I change up the content of some of those tiles, or if I change how frequently some of the tiles can spawn, what's that going to do to my map generation? And normally, again, like to use the naive approach, if you want to know, then you make those changes and you run through some levels and you try and just infer from a small set how the feeling has changed. But Gillian's way of doing it means that you can make those tweaks to, the probability of certain levels spawning. And then if you have your metrics set up in a way that you're happy with, you can run through and create this visualization and compare it to others. And obviously, any type of thing like this, you're losing some details in order to simplify it down. But what you've got is a way of looking at how has my generative space changed by tweaking these values. And it seems to me like there's a lot of possibility there, in that normally, due to time constraints, you'd only be able to do so much tweaking. But if you had this system set up, you could try, almost an arbitrary number of permutations of those different tweaks, and then look at all of them and pick out which ones seem most interesting, as opposed to having to practically only have had time to look at, 5 of them.
Is there an easy way to optimize for these parameters? You parameterize certain things about your generator space. You have your way of measuring them. But in terms of your actual generator, I'm just imagining the difficulties of trying to optimize your generator for these parameters you want out of it.
Yeah, there's an interesting back and forth. I mean, I think that one of the things that becomes very difficult, which is always difficult in these kinds of things, is picking your metrics. I mean, if your metrics aren't really getting what you want, then you're bad data in, bad data out. But I do think that if you are able to know the metric you were looking for, then probably you could either have an algorithmic kind of approach of highlighting, flagging combinations that are creating the type of pattern that you're looking for. Or something I like about the whole visualization part of it is that, the human brain is extremely good at detecting patterns, visually and things like that. And so there are some problems where, you can try and solve it with a computer, but your own human brain will actually do so much better and so much easier that, you might as well just do that. So if you can get just this visual representation and you understand that, if you are trying to select for levels that have high difficulty or something like that, if you've set it up so that means a cluster kind of on the right side of the grid, that's very easy to pick out visually once you have them all there in front of you. And then you can kind of work backwards and figure out, okay, what were the parameters that were used to create that particular space?
But chaos theory comes in again there, because you start tweaking and you find that actually, you make some change that you thought would make things more difficult, but changes so many other things in the system that suddenly it's much easier in different ways.
Yeah, so part of where this all comes back into chaos theory is that chaos theory is inherently not really the study of any particular system, but the study of the patterns that make up many, many different types of systems. So chaos theory, the thing that came out of Lorenz's work is that, where we left off, Lorenz had just realized that basically weather prediction was going to be impossible, which was very upsetting for meteorologists, because basically what he found was because of that sensitivity to initial conditions, even if you had the entire planet Earth covered in probes that were a meter apart, measuring everything you needed to know of temperature and wind, you still wouldn't be able to predict weather too much far ahead, because in between those 1 meter chunks, there'd be information you were missing, and that would, spiral out of control. So this was a very bad result. And if it ended here, then this would just be like a very bad day for science. But the positive was that Lorenz kept looking at it because he felt like there was some kind of pattern that underlied what looked like chaos. And he turned out to be right. And it turned out that systems that follow certain types of traits have shared patterns. And so whether you're looking at a model of a weather system, or if you're looking at kind of viscosity and fluid dynamics, like when you add milk to a cup of coffee and you can see that neat effect where the different kind of liquids are mixing, the calculations for that and the calculations for weather and for animal populations over time, they're all similar types of equations. And when you are able to visualize them, you can actually see that they share patterns. And those patterns don't let you precisely predict the output of the system, but they let you understand how the system works in a way that lets you work with it. Like you can't work with it as precisely as you would with a linear system, but you can kind of work around it. And so a lot of chaos theory was developed in the 70s and was popularized in the 80s. And the reason why it came about that time was largely because of computers. It was because there were new ways of visualizing systems. So in the same way that I was saying that Gillian's work is a way as a game designer to speed up the process of looking at many different outputs in a way that lets you make intelligent decisions about your generator, chaos theory was able to develop because computers let mathematicians and physicists run through a simulation in its entirety, over days and days or years of simulated time very quickly and look at the output. And when they were able to do that, they were able to suddenly notice these patterns that had always been there, but that they weren't able to be aware of before. And so in chaos theory in particular, there's a concept of phase space. And so phase space is where you take your system and you take the variables that govern it. So if you have something simple like a pendulum in 2 dimensions, you can measure the state of a pendulum with the velocity and the position of the end of the pendulum bob. So as it goes back and forth, the velocity goes, from 0 at the, extreme end of it to 1 when it's the fastest, and, things like that. And the position's going back and forth. And so what you can do is you can say, okay, the x-axis of my graph is velocity, and the y-axis is position. And I'm going to run the pendulum, and every second, I'm going to make a little dot on my graph of what the current velocity and position are. And if you don't have friction, what you get is a perfect circle, because the pendulum will go back and forth in the same way. And so those variables will loop, and you'll get a nice little circle. And that's called a phase space diagram. And so you can look at that, and without knowing much more about what system it is, you can understand, oh, this is a repeating kind of simple system. And then you get into more complex things. So Lorenz was able to take his work on weather systems and simplify it down to just 3 equations that had the same amount of complexity in their behavior. And so he made a 3-dimensional map with these 3 equations. And what he got is this shape called the Lorenz Tractor. And this is one where I would encourage, listeners to Google Lorenz Tractor and look at a picture of it. You might actually recognize it because it's kind of the emblem of chaos theory, but it's this strange shape that also looks kind of like a butterfly, which I think is why the butterfly effect also took off as a term. But the point of it is that it has a defined shape. You can look at it and you can see it's kind of got these 2 wings, but it actually never precisely repeats itself. And so it's one of these examples where by visualizing it in 3-dimensional space, you can understand something about the system, and you can understand, including the fact that it never will actually precisely repeat, but it has these things called attractors, which are these 2 kind of wings that the system will more or less switch between. So I find it interesting that a lot of the history and even I think the modern practice of looking at chaotic systems has to do with how do you visualize a system in a way that lets you observe patterns. And then I think that Gillian's work is kind of doing the same thing from another direction, which is if you're creating a system, how do you visualize the output in a way that lets you look for patterns?
And you said earlier, of course, one of the challenges is figuring out what you're trying to visualize. So there's so much you could visualize about this set of outputs that your system is producing, but choosing the right game design outputs is tricky.
Yeah. Well, so I think that is an interesting thing. It was actually, so when I was giving this talk at Roguelike Celebration, I was talking to Jongwoo Kim from Kitfox Games about it. And he kind of put it quite nicely that these are problems that are kind of, they're approaching a key problem, but from different directions. Because with chaos theory, you have an existing system in nature or in the physical world, and you're trying to learn about it through looking at the patterns. So in that case, the choice of, what to model, like what equations are there, is already made for you because it's a real system. But what you're trying to do is that you don't quite understand how it works, and you need to reconstruct that looking at the patterns. Whereas when you're doing it from the procedural generation angle, you do have to do that hard work of figuring out, like, what are the equations that let me get meaningful visualization? Like, what patterns you want, and you're trying to figure out what equations and what numbers that go into them will give me those patterns. So it's an interesting kind of thing where they both meet in the middle at this idea of how do I visualize a system and look for patterns, but you're starting at 2 different points.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, Lorenz was looking at tornadoes in Bolivia, but not necessarily caring about the humidity in the Sahara, if you understand me there. What you're wanting to get out of it can vary immensely. And measuring some of these things is also very hard. So I don't want to get too into it, but measuring difficulty of a level, for instance, you can have AI bots that run through a level and see how many of them survive. And it could be that the AIs can all survive quite easily, but only through incredibly boring gameplay mechanisms.
Right, exactly.
And that wouldn't necessarily be the experience that you're wanting the player to do. And so one of the things that's interesting for me is the amount of actual chaos in your system, your generative space, just how variable it is. That you can have 61 million examples in that set of generative things, but how similar are they to each other, and how different a gameplay experience do they give to each other? And to a certain extent, you maybe want a certain consistency as long as there's enough variability between play. You want your castle level generator to always produce castle-like things, for instance. But yeah, at what point do you distinguish interesting content within that set? And to what extent do you want a certain variable spread within your set? So I keep saying set because there's a certain amount of set theory going on here as well, that each of these generative spaces is essentially a set. to borrow the terminology from another branch of mathematics.
Right.
And the characterization of that set is the sort of the challenge on the game design side, both being able to characterize it and being able to decide how you want it to be characterized. So what spread? Do you have, 80% of the levels are roughly this shape and the other 20% go wild in different ways? And there's these sorts of other ways of perceiving this sort of set of outputs that you've got.
No, I think that's all excellent points. And that I think something that's funny is that if you were to look at the natural systems that chaos theory kind of came out of studying, if you evaluated them as a level designer or a game designer, they would be horrible systems. Because the whole reason why it took so long for chaos theory to kind of come into fruition was not just the computers being not around at first, but one frustration that physicists, and especially young physicists in the 60s and 70s had, was that for all that physics had gone a long way, there was still things like turbulence were so poorly understood. So physics could tell you about, the fundamental, quantum parts of matter and all these extremely difficult problems. But if you were to go out and point at a cloud and asked a physicist, like, tell me exactly how that cloud is formed and how they mix with each other, or if you were to have a waterfall and kind of point at two things that started next to each other at the top of the waterfall and ask a physicist, tell me exactly how those are going to end up in relation to each other at the bottom of the waterfall. Those were all questions that a physicist could not give you an answer to because the systems were chaotic. They were deterministic. There's nothing random about it. The way that fluids work, these are all understood. We have equations for them. But the output you get is through this chaotic process that by looking at the output, it's extremely difficult to infer anything. And sometimes you don't even know that a pattern is there, which is, I think, if you had a generator that was giving you, I think, I'm sure we've all had some experiences like that where you have the output that's a little bit too random or random in the sense of being deterministic, but chaotic. And so as a player, you're unable to find that satisfying predictive feeling of knowing in some kind of intuitive way what you're looking at. And I do think that you're totally correct that as a player, that usually is a less valid experience. And we often want to strike the sweet spot of it being interesting and, have enough variety to feed that replayability, but still be cohesive enough that a player who's looking at it can start making intuitions. And that is extremely difficult to do. And that's why I think that approaching the problem from as many different directions as possible will help you get to a good solution, because it's just, any one solution is not going to be enough to handle a problem with so many dimensions.
Yeah. And particularly this whole thing you've talked about parameterizing that, like putting measurable things about the outputs of your generator and thinking about how to visualize that and assess that. And especially, many game designers end up building a whole library of different generators over time. The things they do for one game they'll end up tweaking and using differently for another game. And having a way in which you can sort of really look at these different generators and how they relate to each other can be interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of risk of, when you're reusing generators and stuff like that, or even just when you're dealing with parameters. There's the concept of kind of local maxima of if you're trying to evaluate for something, if you're trying to see what's good, it can be easy if you're only changing by small amounts because you're in that tweaking kind of mindset. You can end up at what's the maximum in that local area. But what you don't realize is that if you were willing to make a big jump and a big change, there'd be an even better maximum somewhere else. And I think that that's a problem, it's a mathematic kind of problem, but it's something that comes up with a generator, because if you're tweaking at the point where you haven't looked at all the big changes, you might miss out on the fact that a big change would take you in a direction that would end up better. And so these kinds of methods of being able to more easily look at the big swath of what's everything I could be doing with this system is perhaps at least an approach to avoiding that kind of pitfall.
I think what we need is generators to make our generators.
Generatorception.
Yeah, because that way then we wouldn't have to do all this tweaking by hand of our generators. We would just have a system that tells us here's 20 different ways you could use your generator that will produce 20 different things each, and then we can all stop doing our jobs.
Well, it is interesting because I've talked to a professor once at the University of Alberta about this concept of, it was related to the idea of metrics, and it was actually about difficulty. and using AIs. And it was the concept that if you had the right kind of metrics of what does a successful, level or what have you look like, and you were able to define that solidly enough, then you could kind of hand the reins over to an AI and say, listen, give me a solution that optimizes for these particular variables, and you're free to make as big a change as you want. And it would run through and it would, permutate and change everything in order to figure out and come back and say, okay, well, here are the solutions that maximize for those parameters that you wanted, which I think is interesting. It's just that, as we've been saying, figuring out what those parameters are in a way that actually gives you a good result is extremely difficult.
Yeah, very hard. And, we're just talking about the generators, but there's also how the generators intersect with the game mechanics, how they culturally intersect with the way in which players play games. And there's all sorts of subtleties there that at the moment require the human touch, or at the very least, we like to think so.
Or like I was saying, there are things that, human brains kind of are optimized for already, in the same way that, we're not very good at decomposing prime numbers or doing complex mathematical work in our heads. Most of us, the brain is not necessarily fantastic at that, but a computer, that's kind of its whole deal. So I at least am of the opinion that there's a nice healthy distinction, and that computers will always, well, or at least for a while, have the things that they're great at, and we should rely on that. But we should also recognize that pattern matching is something that naturally our brain is kind of a computer that's been optimized to do that. And so I think that by working together is how we get the best results.
Indeed.
Something else I think is interesting to kind of jump back in terms of, you were talking about that process of creating the generator and kind of getting the cohesion, but also the randomness. It's interesting to me that so when it comes to chaos theory, the types of systems that have this kind of chaotic behavior that makes them worth studying and fall under the chaos umbrella are systems that have some element of non-linearity. And so I mentioned, Lorenz having his 3 equations and how all of these different simulations are basically just sets of equations. And the important thing is that some of those equations, so like in Lorenz's case, all 3 of them were nonlinear equations. And what that means, the easiest example is, or at least as a Canadian, is a hockey puck on the ice. I hope this carries over culturally, but imagine a rock sliding on the ice. It's the same thing. So friction is a nonlinear equation, which means that the amount of friction that your hockey puck is experiencing depends on the speed. So how fast it's going will impact how much friction is impacting it. But how fast it's going is impacted by the friction. If there's very high friction, then it will be slowed down quite significantly. And so there's this interdependence where to calculate the friction, you need to know the speed. But to calculate the speed, you need to know the friction. And so it's this kind of recursive mess. And it means that you can't just solve in the same way. Like there are techniques for solving nonlinear equations, but they only work for certain types. And these are the kinds of equations that if you're, a physicist or a mathematician, you want to avoid because they're such a pain to work with. But they come up very often in real world systems, and they're very tied to this kind of chaotic situation. And so I think it's interesting that when you jump back then to generators, you have the types of generators that are quite simple and like set theory, like combinatorial, where it's just kind of, I have a bucket of 5 of, names, and I have 10 classes, and I have, 6 personality types, and I'm just going to grab a random thing from each bucket and spit something out. And that tends to give you, simple to understand randomness, and it doesn't have any kind of context to it. There's nothing making sure that, bards are more likely to have flamboyant personalities. You don't have connections like that. And that can be good and that can be bad. But I think that what we see is that in more complex generation systems, you start having almost a type of nonlinearity, and that things that are chosen in one kind of set tie back into another that gives you this kind of chaos pattern within the randomness feeling, where you can start teasing out kind of contextual relationships and get, I think, like what you can really sink your teeth into. And so I don't know if it would be fair to actually call that nonlinear, but it's interesting to me that this feels like it's kind of another way that there's a mapping of concepts between how we think of procedural generation and how we think of chaos theory.
Yeah, just to bring in another branch of mathematics, we've discussed on the show before about the use of graph theory in design of roguelikes to ensure sort of sequential elements within a random system. And it's just interesting to think of the intersection of chaos theory and of set theory with the graph theory as well, just to expand the maths more here. And there's again, coming back to sort of wanting to have structure within your game. So it's not random. Well, I say random. It's all, of course, pseudo-randomness, but to the player eyes, it seems all random. But the ways in which you can sort of intersect these different branches of mathematics to have the structure there whilst keeping that unpredictability, but still offering a cohesive gameplay experience.
Yeah, it is. It's really interesting. I feel like, of the different branches of mathematics, like, I don't have a deep understanding of many of them, but it is curious how much intersection there is, which I actually think, like, something I like about the roguelike community is that it's quite academic, at least by the standards of, in comparison to where my professional life usually is, in more of like the AAA kind of space. Developers don't tend to come as much out of academia or have like ties to universities or things like that. It's very much, you get your degree in whatever, your comp sci degree, and then you start making games at EA or what have you. And, not to, slag it, like, I love it. But I find that there's an interesting, curious quality to the roguelike community, which I always love when I go to Roguelike Celebration and things like that, where a lot of the active work and games are coming from people who are academics or who have more of a tie there. And I wonder if that is like particularly fruitful, in that it seems like quite a lot of mathematics is highly relevant to procedural generation. Like, I think, wasn't Tarn Adams a mathematician?
Yeah, he had a PhD in maths. He had a very successful academic career in maths before deciding the Dwarf Fortress was more important than all of mathematics.
Which I'm selfishly extremely happy that he made that decision.
But yeah, I think mathematics does lead a lot of people to play with procedural generative systems. I mean, Conway's Game of Life came out of a mathematician in the 70s, and that's a little procedural toy, and it's easy to branch off from there into lots of other things. And I always make the joke that roguelikes are a great game to make if you want to be a really lazy game designer, because you don't have to make any of the level designs yourself. The theme and the mechanics you just borrow from other games that have done it before. It's nice and simple, but lets you tinker about with procedural systems and things and create something original.
I really think like that tinkering aspect and the way that I feel like when it comes just to programming as a concept, because I started as a programmer, the most magical thing about programming and computers that really like grabs people, especially, kids, is that moment where you've put something down in the computer and you click a button and then you see something that was created, and it was created from your kind of intent. I joke that it's the closest thing to being a wizard, which is that you learn a bunch of esoteric words and phrases, and by sticking them together, you can make stuff happen. And I think that's like the juicy thing about programming. And I think the procedural generation and kind of roguelikes are a very juicy part of game design in the same way, in that, by understanding a few systems, or often by not even needing to understand them or make them yourself, just kind of borrowing other generators, you can make some tweaks and you can see all this interesting content that you kind of created in this collaborative process with a machine. And I think it's a interesting tie, because I mentioned how this book, Chaos, Making a New Science, is a very kind of humanized history. Chaos theory was one of these things. It was a revolution in science and had a lot of pushback because the claims it was making were very bold at the time, it's so funny to try and get people to understand now, because it ended up that, like, in our modern age, the understanding from chaos theory has become so, ingrained that it doesn't sound surprising to us anymore. But at the time it really was. And a lot of the people who the book talks about and who were involved in chaos theory, your people like Mandelbrot and, getting into fractals and stuff, were people who liked to tinker. Lorenz had his vacuum computer and was tinkering with it. There's this guy Feigenbaum who was working in Los Alamos, and he taught himself some programming so he could tinker with these kind of systems and look for patterns. I think that it's a very similar type of person, almost even, that comes up, who was interested in visualizing these attractors and these phase spaces and thinking of systems and tweaking them. Feels very similar to the feeling of being someone who's drawn to tweaking and playing with the output of generators.
Indeed, yes. So one other topic I want to get into was, we've discussed applications of chaos theory to the generator, but the other piece is in the gameplay mechanics themselves, the interactions that the player has within the world of their game. And I think there's an interesting piece here around, chaos theory obviously is about the complexities that arise through deterministic interactions. And some roguelikes have a lot of randomness in their mechanics. Your staff does 1d6 plus 1 damage or something like that.
Right. Whilst
others like Hoplite are purely deterministic. When you move into an enemy, you always hit and kill it. And that's sort of the simple way of it. And the deterministic games, which I personally like to make, mostly deterministic games, have this interesting thing of being able to have such complexity coming out of those base deterministic elements that they have the feeling of the random systems do as well, because of chaos theory, essentially. It's not even chaos theory, actually, really. It's more just simply the intense branching opportunities to come about.
Right. Well, I think that it would be fair probably to say that, the game design and the systems in those kinds of roguelikes do satisfy the chaotic system kind of requirements of sensitivity to initial conditions. Like, there's enough dependence in different things in those kinds of games that a small difference in an initial setup, once you actually ran it through, several turns or whatever, can create vastly different behavior. It's like there's the whole, because of the loss of a nail, the country was lost, like that kind of metaphor of the nail wasn't there for the horse hoof, which meant that the horse couldn't get through the mud, which meant the army couldn't get to the battle, which means the battle was lost and the country was lost. I think that is very much what, stupid deaths and things look like in roguelikes, where because of a small thing that went wrong at one stage, once you actually play it out, that little difference resulted in a, death. And I think that is a tie to this kind of notion in chaos theory of sensitivity to initial conditions. So I think you're right that there's some combination there as well.
And there's two, in my opinion, two sort of game design considerations there. The first is making sure your system actually has sort of enough possibilities for emergent complexity. So the obvious thing is comparing checkers and drafts. And they have a similar number of pieces going on. But drafts is... So did I say checkers and drafts?
You did. No, I'm going to admit I don't know what drafts is.
Sorry. Drafts is just checkers. I meant to say chess and drafts.
Okay.
Sorry. Chess or chess and checkers, if that terminology is more easy. So the difference between chess and checkers, where chess and checkers each have a similar number of pieces. They play out in sort of similar ways. There are a large number of statistical outcomes for checkers, not as large as chess. But it's an inherently more boring game than chess, even taking into account the fact that statistically it's got a lower set of statistical outcomes. Though that set of statistical outcomes it has are more similar to each other compared with chess, which can have much more advanced strategies and interest and intrigue. And even kind of chess has the ability to create narratives in a way that checkers does not. And that's one of the things we want in our games. We want our games to create memorable experiences.
Right. No, and just as an aside, if you haven't seen Chogue, Chess Rogue from Roguelike Celebration this year, it was completely fantastic. That's also up on the YouTube channel, along with my talk and the Lightning Talks. But yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. And it's interesting how many ways of looking at that there is. Like, I feel like part of the difference is that when you're a player playing checkers, the number of options you have, like how many moves to take, they're very similar. And, the possibility space of what am I going to do this turn is relatively quite small. Whereas chess has the combination of all the different rules and the different pieces and how they interact with each other, and more of like a forward-looking aspect that your possibility space as a player in a given turn is much wider, which I think plays into that.
Yeah, and the fact that you can have... There's more vectors to those pieces. The queen can move in any direction kind of thing. And it's those sorts of little details that actually create this large emergent complexity. That kind of... It doesn't need to be a lot of complexity, but it needs to be complexity in the right ways.
Yeah, I think like interdependence being a large way. Like at chess, maybe it's not fair to say that it has interdependence. I think it gets away without it. But I feel like a lot of games and roguelikes, it's the combination of those systems. It's the way that they're not isolated, So
poker might be more of an example where you have 52 cards, but what's important actually is how the cards interact with each other.
Right, yeah. And so the leveling up, like I feel like a lot of, the good simulations in roguelike games is the way that they all stack on top of each other of, the reason why you care about this is because it also impacts this system, which also impacts this system. And that's how you get this behavior where, one little thing in one place has so many knock-on effects. Though, of course, the danger is keeping that understandable for the player so that it doesn't feel completely random in a way that's frustrating.
Yeah, so that can be the big danger, is that there's so many moving parts, and a computer could keep track of them all, but a player not necessarily can, or maybe the player could, but not being able to look ahead far enough. And chess, actually, I'll bring up as an example of a game that for new players is actually very frustrating, because the actual complexity very quickly builds up, and to be able to spot the patterns of this is the right strategy, this is the wrong strategy, can be quite difficult. So it's great if you're an expert player and you really get into it. But as a new player, going up against more experienced people can be a frustrating experience. Right,
which I'm sure is kind of similar. Like, the first time that you take someone and try and sit them down and get them to play NetHack or, God forbid, Dwarf Fortress, there's a learning process where they're not necessarily ready to jump in and feel like they understand what's going on. I joke, but it's not entirely a joke, that it is, to get into Dwarf Fortress at the level where you're just playing it and enjoying it is like a month of steady studying.
And there's the eternal problem in roguelike game design of wanting to make the early game variable enough for your veteran players, but understandable enough for your new players. And it's a somewhat intractable problem. But it comes into this of kind of, if you have a system whereby your actions all have impact, then you will quickly make some decisions that are detrimental down the line as a new player. So, but if you strip the impactful decisions out of the early game, it stops being interesting for the experienced player. And one of the things in sort of the designing around this is that kind of knock-on effect of your actions, the propagation of outcomes throughout the game. And FTL is a great example of this, where lots of people play FTL and say, this game's too random, it's too hard, I hate it. And it's not, they're just not very good at it. Or at the very least, it's not even, they can be reasonably good, but you actually have to be enough ahead of the kind of impact curve, the way in which your mistakes build up. You need to be ahead of that enough to be able to win in a relatively consistent way. Right. Otherwise, you're relying on getting lucky, and you cannot rely on getting lucky in a good game.
And it is interesting because I think it's always hard as a designer to strike the balance, because when the players fail to understand it and they say, oh well, this was too hard, that can be frustrating, because you can say like, well, no, it was there. But also as a designer, your job is to make that understandable, and that feeling of, oh, I made a mistake many turns ago that now that's why I'm dying right now, can be a little hard to do. I mean, sometimes it goes well. It's like you have something like Crypto the Necrodancer, where when you die, you see enough of your previous turns that you can look at that and know what you did wrong. But then I find, XCOM, Enemy Unknown, things like that, I find it frustrating how you can end up in a situation where you're in the late game and you've made enough mistakes that you're probably dead. Like, you're not going to be able to come back from this. But the game is not able or doesn't actually give you a fail state. So you can kind of keep limping along. But if you understand the systems well enough, you realize that, you're just done for. And it can be a bit frustrating as a player if you're in that situation where either you do know that you're done, but the game isn't recognizing it yet, or if you die and you don't know how to draw that line back of understanding that it's because of something you did 2 hours ago.
Mm. So one thing some games do is they not exactly reset the player, but they have there's a certain limit to the determinism of the outputs. So for instance, in Tales of Magial, instead of stocking up healing potions, you have healing runes and such in the game that have a recharge rate of 20 or 25 turns or so. So that every 20 turns, you're probably fully healed. So you do not end up with this expanding set of possibilities so much, because there's a certain element of reset every now and then. And it means that the game is more focused on your within 20 turns thinking rather than your within 2,000 turns thinking. So it's more of a tactical game than a strategic game.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, well, and I find games with a save state that aren't, the permadeath style mode, you get almost the thing that Lorenz had, where he had, he'd run his weather system, he saw something interesting, and then he tried to go back. And he was surprised to find that quickly because of small changes, the output was quite different. I think it's fun that part of why I feel like it's so hard to explain to people that used to be shocking was that if you played a game with save states and it's got, simulation-y kind of elements, or even if it doesn't, you understand that if you go back to a save point and you play through again, but you make slightly different choices, you can end up with vastly different outcomes because of the same type of process.
Yeah, which brings me to a game idea I've always wanted to be able to do, but never had the immense free time and technical ability, which is a game where you get to explore chaos theory through sort of time travel, whereby you can go back in time and amend things, and then the generator produces a new future based on the impact of deterministically. Based on the impact of the things that you did. And say you're moving between two epochs. And my dream was always to have butterflies that if you kill them, it becomes less variable, the outcomes. So killing butterflies makes things even more deterministic.
Right.
But there's a sort of almost an opportunity there for people. So we as designers fiddle with these generators all the time. And it's wonderful. It feels like you're sort of playing with infinity. You're not. It's just maths. But
maths is infinity.
Well, we're not actually playing with infinite sets. We're playing with sets big enough to be infinite to us,
right?
Which is cool for us little meat-based things. But there's a chance to give players the sort of ways to fiddle with that too. Giving them generative options and letting them see how their actions can have a kind of chaos theory outcome. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I think. And that's where you get as well the feeling, I think you mentioned earlier with chess, the idea of players creating their own kind of narratives. Like, I feel like games that give the player enough of a feeling of their own kind of generated content, they get that feeling of ownership. Like, by randomly generating settlers until they get ones that they're happy with, they feel like they own that person in the sense of like, this is just for me. This is, I kind of made this through the generator, and they automatically have that level of attachment that then comes into everything in terms of the game design. Like, you need that player buy-in in order to have emotional impact and things like that. But yeah, I feel like, when you look at something like No Man's Sky, for all that had a shaky initial launch, it's kind of found its own later on. And I think that procedural generation became a buzzword for a while and was being used in a broader term than quite made sense. But I think there's an appealing aspect to procedural generation and things like that players pick up on. And yeah, I think ways of getting them to have that feeling through playing the game is kind of exposing that joy that we have as designers.
Okay, I run out of topics I want to discuss. Just check if there's anything else you want to bring up.
There's one random thing I wanted to mention just because I think it's really curious, which is that I didn't even make this connection until today when I was rereading some of these books. But so Rogue was developed at UC Santa Cruz in the late 70s, 1980, I believe. And the funny thing is that at that exact same time, there was this group called the Dynamical Systems Collective, or the Chaos Cabal, which is at UC Santa Cruz, and they were formed in 1977. And that's where a lot of the very important papers and people in chaos theory were working. So I just find it fascinating. It's more just a coincidence than anything else, but the development of Rogue and the development of chaos theory were happening in like the same building in the same years. I found that out, and I thought that it was something interesting to share.
That is very interesting. There's a good chance a lot of the leading professors would have had their students playing Rogue at the time.
Yeah, and I can feel like, not knowing the people involved, obviously, but from reading, it does seem like there's this tie between them. And, I think it's fascinating, too, that in the same way that the work that was being done in chaos theory was coming from both the constraints, but also the new possibilities of technology, the new abilities to visualize and simulate were leading to these discoveries. Roguelikes were coming out of similar things, procedural map generation coming not just from a gameplay conceit, but from just a practical recognition that, you couldn't store level data in the amount of, degree that you wanted. And so being able to generate it let you have many more levels than you could ever store. Like, I feel like it's curious how the development of computers, like, these are both disciplines that were finding novel ways to interact with this new technology and doing it for a large degree in the same building in the same years. So food for thought, I guess.
Indeed. Very interesting. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up. Thank you very much, Alexei. It's been wonderful talking. We'll link, obviously, to the talks you talked about and the books and so on. There'll be lots of interesting links for people to delve through on the blog post. But yes, that is it. Have fun, everyone, with your designs and with chaos. It is fun to play with. Just don't go too far.
No, I think going too far is excellent. You can always dial it back later.
Just don't make pure noise, because that's a lot of chaos and not very exciting. Make exciting chaos.
Yes, interesting chaos, and look at it and visualize it in fun, pretty ways. But yeah, so thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. All right, and good night.
The show has collapsed. Would you like your podcasts identified?